Today's video is the brake job on a 2015 Coleman side-by-side. They're made by Hyson. They have several different models, companies made by the same company. Now what I did do was, before we jacked it up, I took a 16mm socket and I just loosened the lugs on the front tires just so they're loose, so that when I jacked it up I could take them right off without the wheel spinning. Next thing is I got a 13mm, and I'm going to take off the brake caliper. There's one bolt here, and then there's another bolt on the back side. Put a socket on it. Yeah. Right there. So, caliper certainly come off easy enough. So I'll take off the caliper. You don't want the weight of the caliper hanging on your brake line, so you want to find a way to support it. I'll put you on hold. So what originally turned into a how to do a brake job is now turning into how to grease the upper and lower control arms. These are not greased at all from the factory. On the other side it was actually worn out and I had to machine a new one. So I was able to pop them out. I used a pen just to drive that out. This one I got half clean. I'm going to put it back in the vise, polish up the other side, and slather it up with anti-seize. I'm hoping it's better than a grease. And I'm going to put it all back together. So it's I believe a 13 and a 14mm or 16mm. 13 and a 14mm to take the nut and the bolt out. So I'm going to do the bottom. Then I'm going to switch up here to the uppers. I'm going to take that bushing out. Clean it up. Anti-seize it. Put it back together. I think that's going to help quite a bit with the wear rate of the front end. Alright, so here's what wound up happening on the passenger side here. The caliper bolts are coming from the back side. They're Allen heads bolts. They come through to the front here. The head stripped off, so I couldn't get the brakes out to clean the caliper properly. So I cleaned it the best I could. Put caliper grease here. And hopefully that'll be okay. The pads had plenty of life left. But here is where we took the bushings out of the lower control arm and the upper control arms. I polished them with some sandpaper. And I put anti-seize on the outside of the bushing and then in the hole where the bolt passes through, so hopefully it'll travel up and down a little more freely. This side wasn't bad, it's the driver's side that was worn. So here's the driver's side lower control arm. This is the one toward the front. This is the one toward the back. So these are the bushings that came out of them. They didn't wear too much, 900 and 892. But the holes themselves wore out. So I'm going to use the bigger bushing in here And you can see it still has a little bit of slop in it. This one had way too much slop. So I made a new bushing. Only because I had some brass. It might not hold up as well as steel, but I'm sure it'll hold up well enough. And to give you an idea, I machined that to an outside diameter of 9/26. So it's quite a bit bigger than even the bigger of the two. And when I put it in there, it takes out the slop. So that's how it's going back together. I'm going to slather these bushings up with anti-seize so that they do pivot inside of here. Then I'll put anti-seize on the bolts themselves so that they can pivot in that bushing without binding up. On the driver's side brake caliper, I was able to get the pins out that the brake pads slide in and out of. And you can see they were pretty crusty. I put them in a drill and I polished them up with a piece of emery cloth as they spun around. So I'll put some caliper grease on that and put it back together. And this is the driver's side. You can see I cleaned this up quite a bit, and there's still a lot of mud in there. I got to finish cleaning it up. But that's why it's important to take these apart once in a while and clean them. Unfortunately, the other side will not come apart at some point. I'll just buy a new caliper next time I need pads. I'm going to take these apart and grease them up. So on these upper and lower control arms, I do recommend you take these apart and grease them up, put something in there. It's unfortunate they don't have grease fittings. I was going to put one in, but I didn't feel like going through the hassle. It's been for 7 years on the original factory grease, so I'll put it back together and get another 7 years. Alright, on the driver's side caliper, those pistons work. They don't look the best. But this bracket does just pull out. It slides in those two rubber boots. So I'm going to grease them up real good with caliper grease. And put them back in. And make sure those rubber boots snap on. There's a little lip on those studs. And that keeps it all self-contained. So these are the brakes. Surprisingly, they're made out of copper, which of course helps with the corrosion. You can see that's where the caliper pistons hit. And there's the wear marks. So they got plenty of life left. So being I can't get the other side apart, I cleaned them up, sanded them to scuff them up a little bit. I'm going to put some anti-seize on the back here where the pistons hit. I'm going to put some grease on that little half moon, any place that the brakes rub. It's a fine line between enough grease and too much grease, because ultimately it's going to make the dirt stick to it. So these are the bolts that are going to hold the shoes into the caliper. I put a little anti-seize on these threads, some caliper grease on the rod, and it actually is going to slide in these holes of the brake shoes. That's why you want the grease. Alright, it's all finished. Brakes are back on. They're all cleaned up and greased. I took all 4 of the bushings out of the upper and lower control arm. Sanded them really well. They were all rusted. on both sides. Driver's side was worse, on the lower side especially. I did have to make a new bearing to go in the bottom. You can buy the entire new control arm online for 40 bucks. I didn't want to wait for it. I had access to a little lathe, so I had a piece of brass. All back together. I'm going to put a little anti-seize on the studs, put the tire back on, move on to the back brake.